I never imagined my life would end up like this, watching my husband and next-door neighbor in our own garden, laughing together like I was invisible. I sat there frozen, my hands trembling, the weight of betrayal choking me more than the cold November wind ever could. The camera footage played over and over in my mind, each frame burning deeper into my soul. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Sandra, and I'm 67 years old. For the past 42 years, I've lived in a modest apartment in Astoria, Queens, where the smell of fresh bagels from the corner deli mingles with exhaust fumes from the BQE. Every morning, I'd wake to the same routine, brewing coffee in my old aluminum percolator, the one Tony bought me for our 10th anniversary, back when he still remembered anniversaries. The steam would rise like ghosts of better times, fogging up the kitchen window that looked out onto our small courtyard. That courtyard. God, how I loved that little patch of green in our concrete jungle. I planted tomatoes there, marigolds, even tried my hand at roses one summer. It was my sanctuary, my escape from the suffocating walls of our two-bedroom apartment where silence had become our primary language. The irony cuts deep now. That same courtyard became the stage for my husband's betrayal. It started with a security camera. Such a simple thing, really. Just a small device I ordered online after Mrs. Chen from 4B got mugged coming home from her night shift at the laundromat. I thought I was being smart, responsible even. We need to keep an eye on things, I told Tony, mounting the camera discreetly near our fire escape window. He barely looked up from his newspaper. Whatever makes you feel safe, Sandra. If only I'd known that safety was the last thing that camera would bring me. The morning I discovered everything, November 15th, I'll never forget that date, started like any other. I woke at 6:30, as I had for decades. Tony was already gone, supposedly to his early meeting at the law firm where he worked as a paralegal. At 70, he still insisted on working, though his hours had become increasingly erratic over the past year. I shuffled to the kitchen in my worn terry cloth robe, the one with the faded roses that used to make Tony smile. Now it just made me feel invisible. The coffee was bitter that morning, or maybe everything just tasted bitter by then. I couldn't tell anymore. I was wiping down the counter when I heard laughter from outside. Real laughter, the kind that bubbles up from pure joy. I hadn't heard that sound in my own home for so long, I'd almost forgotten what it meant. Curiosity drew me to the window, and there she was, Melissa Rodriguez, our neighbor from the apartment below, sitting on our courtyard bench with someone whose back was turned to me. The someone was wearing Tony's favorite gray sweater. My heart started hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Surely not. Surely my eyes were playing tricks on me, the way they sometimes did in the early morning light filtering through the grimy buildings of Queens. But when he turned, when I saw Tony's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years, the coffee mug slipped from my hands and shattered against the linoleum floor. Brown liquid spread like a stain across the yellow flowers of the pattern I'd chosen with such hope 30 years ago. I stood there, barefoot in the wreckage, watching my husband of 42 years touch another woman's face with a tenderness he'd forgotten to show me. They weren't just talking. They were wrapped in each other's presence like lovers, like people who shared secrets and dreams and intimate moments I'd been excluded from. The camera. The thought hit me like a physical blow. If they were here now, in broad daylight, comfortable enough to be affectionate in our shared space, what had been happening when I wasn't watching? My hands shook as I pulled up the security app on my phone. The footage was all there, time-stamped and digitally preserved. Weeks of meetings I'd never known about. Embraces. Kisses. Conversations where Tony's face showed more animation than I'd seen in our living room in months. I watched my marriage die in high definition, frame by frame. The worst part wasn't even the physical betrayal. It was seeing Tony laugh. Really laugh, the way he used to when we first met at that hospital in Manhattan where I worked as a nurse and he was recovering from a motorcycle accident. He'd been 28 then, cocky and charming, with dreams of becoming a lawyer and promises of a life filled with adventure. I was 25, fresh out of nursing school, believing in love stories and happy endings. I believed in him. I gave up everything for that belief. My career, my dreams of traveling, my friendships that couldn't survive the constant drama Tony seemed to attract. When he decided to go to law school at 30, I worked double shifts to support us. When he failed the bar exam twice, I held him while he cried and told him we'd try again. When his drinking got bad in his 40s, I covered for him, made excuses, pretended everything was fine. When our son Michael was born with a learning disability, I became his advocate, fighting with schools and insurance companies while Tony retreated into his work. When our daughter Emily struggled with addiction in her 20s, I was the one who drove to rehab centers at 3 in the morning, who emptied our savings account for treatment programs, who held her hair while she was sick from withdrawal. Tony was always somewhere else, working late, having important meetings, dealing with stress I apparently couldn't understand. I understood more than he ever gave me credit for. I understood that I'd become the foundation everyone else built their lives on while slowly crumbling myself. The camera footage showed me something else. In clip after clip, I could see myself moving through our apartment like a ghost. Cleaning, cooking, organizing, maintaining the life Tony came home to each night. I looked so small, so tired. When had I gotten so old? When had my shoulders started curving forward like I was carrying an invisible weight? When had I stopped mattering in my own life? The confrontation, when it finally came, was uglier than any fight we'd ever had. I waited until evening, after Tony returned home whistling, actually whistling, for the first time in years. He looked surprised to see me sitting at our small dining table with my phone in front of me. The video paused on a frame of him and Melissa kissing in our courtyard. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, then defensive anger. "Sandra, what the hell is this? You tell me, Tony. You tell me what this is." He looked at the screen, and I watched 42 years of marriage collapse in real time. No denials. No explanations. Just a long, heavy sigh that said everything. "How long?" I asked. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me. Everything about this matters to me." 6 months, he said finally. "It started 6 months ago." 6 months. While I'd been planning our 42nd anniversary dinner, he'd been planning a different future entirely. "Do you love her?" Another silence. Then, "I don't know. Maybe. She makes me feel alive." Alive. As if I'd been killing him all these years with my devotion, my sacrifices, my unconditional love. "And what do I make you feel?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something I'd never seen before in his eyes. "Pity. Safe," he said. "You make me feel safe, Sandra." But safe isn't enough anymore. Safe wasn't enough. The woman who'd held his hand through law school, who'd raised his children, who'd forgiven his mistakes and celebrated his victories, who'd built their entire life around his needs and dreams, she was just safety. Just the familiar, comfortable option he could take for granted while seeking excitement elsewhere. That night, I sat in our bathroom with a pair of scissors, cutting up our wedding photos one by one. 42 years of memories reduced to confetti on the tile floor. In each picture, I could see the woman I used to be, bright-eyed, hopeful, so certain that love would be enough. Love wasn't enough. It never had been. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I called in sick to the volunteer job I'd held at the local community center, where I helped seniors navigate Medicare and Social Security paperwork. I'd been doing that work for 5 years, unpaid, because it felt good to be needed, to be useful. Instead, I walked to the Chase Bank on Northern Boulevard and opened my own checking account. For the first time in 4 decades, I had money that was just mine. Not much. I'd been putting small amounts aside from my Social Security payments, money Tony never asked about because it wasn't significant enough to matter to him. But it mattered to me. It was freedom in the form of direct deposits and debit cards. The banker, a young woman named Jessica, treated me with more respect in 20 minutes than I'd received at home in 20 years. She listened to my questions, explained my options, never once made me feel stupid or insignificant. When I left the bank, I had to sit on a bench outside and cry. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being treated like a person whose decisions mattered. That afternoon, I visited 3 divorce attorneys in Flushing. The first one, an older man who kept checking his phone during our consultation, made me feel like I was wasting his time. The second one quoted fees that would drain my small savings account, then suggested I try counseling first, as if I hadn't spent decades trying to fix what was broken. The third attorney was different. Maria Santos had an office above a Dominican restaurant, and her waiting room smelled like pernil and hope. She was maybe 50, with graying hair she wore in a professional bun and eyes that had seen enough heartbreak to recognize mine without judgment. "How can I help you?" she asked, and something in her voice told me she actually wanted to know. I showed her the videos. All of them. Weeks of evidence of my husband's affair, playing out in our own courtyard like some twisted soap opera. Maria watched without flinching, taking notes, occasionally asking questions about dates and times. "You have a solid case for adultery," she said finally. "In New York, that can affect the division of assets, especially if you can prove he used marital funds to support this relationship." Marital funds. As if the money I'd helped earn, the life I'd helped build, was just a ledger to be divided. But it was more than that. It was acknowledgement that I'd contributed to something, that my work had value even if it had never been paid work. That the sacrifices I'd made weren't just foolish charity but investments in a partnership that was now being dissolved. "What do you want, Sandra?" Maria asked. "What would make this right for you?" I thought about that question all night. What did I want? For 42 years, I'd wanted Tony to love me the way I loved him. Completely, loyally, without reservation. I'd wanted our children to appreciate the life I'd helped give them. I'd wanted to matter. But wanting hadn't gotten me anywhere. Maybe it was time to demand instead. The divorce papers were filed on a rainy Tuesday in December. Tony came home to find them on the dining room table next to a plate of the chicken parmesan he used to say was his favorite. I'd made it one last time, perfectly seasoned and golden brown, not because I thought food could fix anything, but because I wanted to remember that I was good at taking care of people, even people who didn't deserve it. You can't be serious, he said, holding the papers like they might burst into flames. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Sandra, we can work this out. Melissa, she's nothing. You're my wife. The word wife felt different now. Not like a partnership or a sacred bond, but like ownership. Like a title that came with obligations and expectations but no benefits. I was your wife, I corrected. I was your wife when you were studying for the bar. I was your wife when you were too drunk to come home. I was your wife when Michael needed help with school and you were always working. I was your wife when Emily was in rehab and you said dealing with addicts made you uncomfortable. I was your wife for everything hard and difficult and thankless. My voice was getting stronger with each word. But I wasn't your wife when you decided to find someone who made you feel alive. I wasn't your wife when you chose to keep secrets and tell lies. I wasn't your wife when you decided that 42 years of my life wasn't worth your honesty. Tony sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. What do you want me to say, Sandra? I don't want you to say anything. I want you to sign the papers and find somewhere else to live. I want you to tell the children what you've done instead of letting them think I'm the one breaking up our family. And I want you to understand that this isn't about punishment or revenge. This is about me finally choosing myself. Choosing myself. The words felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd never learned. But they also felt true. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings and family drama. Emily flew in from her job in Phoenix, furious and demanding to know why I was being so dramatic. Michael took time off from his accounting firm in New Jersey to stage what he called an intervention. Both of my children, my babies I'd protected and provided for their entire lives, sat in my living room and asked me to forgive their father. Again. He made a mistake, Mom, Emily said, still beautiful at 39 despite everything addiction had put her through. People make mistakes. This wasn't a mistake, I replied. Mistakes are accidental. This was a choice. Multiple choices, made over 6 months, to prioritize someone else's feelings over mine. But you love Dad, Michael argued. At 41, my son was practical like his father, always looking for the sensible solution that would disturb the status quo the least. You guys have been together forever. You can't just throw that away. Forever. I'd thought we were forever too. I'd planned my whole life around forever. I'm not throwing anything away, I said. Your father already did that. I'm just refusing to keep picking up the pieces. They didn't understand. How could they? They'd grown up watching me absorb every crisis, smooth over every conflict, sacrifice my own needs to keep the family stable. To them, I was less a person than a function, the fixed point around which everything else could safely revolve. But I was tired of being stable. I was tired of being the one who bent so everyone else could stand straight. The only person who understood was Mrs. Alvarez from the apartment across the hall. Rosa had been widowed 3 years earlier, and she'd watched my marriage with the clear eyes of someone who'd loved deeply and lost honestly. Mija, she said one evening over coffee in her kitchen, I watched my Eduardo die in my arms after 51 years together. 51 years of fighting and making up, of raising kids and burying parents, of being poor and getting by and sometimes even being happy. And you know what Eduardo never did? He never made me wonder if I mattered to him. Even when we were so angry we couldn't speak, I never doubted that he loved me. She paused to sip her coffee, black and strong the way she'd learned to make it as a young bride in Puerto Rico. Tony made you doubt, she continued. He made you question your own worth. That's not love, Sandra. That's not even like. That's just habit. Habit. The word stung because it was true. We'd been going through the motions of marriage for so long, I'd forgotten what the real thing was supposed to feel like. Rosa was right. Eduardo Alvarez had been a bus driver for the MTA, nothing fancy or impressive, but he'd come home every night and asked Rosa about her day. He'd helped with homework and grocery shopping and never once made her feel like her contributions didn't count. I'd watched them through 40 years of being neighbors, seen Eduardo bring Rosa flowers from the bodega just because it was Thursday, watched him hold her hand while they waited for the bus to take them to their doctor appointments. That was partnership. That was love. What I'd had with Tony was something else entirely. The separation agreement took 3 months to finalize. Tony fought me on everything, the apartment, the savings account, even my grandmother's pearl necklace that had been mine before we were married. His lawyer, an aggressive young man in an expensive suit, treated me like I was trying to steal something that didn't belong to me. My own life, apparently, was something I had to fight for. But Maria Santos was a warrior in a navy blazer. She documented everything, the years I'd worked extra shifts to support Tony's education, the inheritance from my parents that had gone toward the down payment on our apartment, the value of the unpaid labor I'd provided as a wife and mother for 4 decades. In New York, Maria explained, marriage is considered an economic partnership. Your contributions aren't just emotional, they're financial. The court will recognize that. The court. I'd never imagined my marriage would end in a courtroom, reduced to financial calculations and legal precedents. But there we were on a cold February morning, sitting across from each other in front of a judge who'd probably seen 1,000 stories just like ours. Tony's lawyer painted me as a bitter woman trying to punish her husband for a momentary lapse in judgment. My lawyer presented 42 years of financial records showing a pattern of my earnings and sacrifices supporting Tony's career and our family's stability. The judge, a tired-looking woman in her 60s, listened to both sides with the patience of someone who'd heard every excuse and justification in the book. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of experience. Mr. Romano, she said, addressing Tony, adultery is not a momentary lapse in judgment. It's a fundamental breach of the marital contract. Mrs. Romano's contributions to this marriage, both financial and domestic, are clearly documented. She's entitled to equitable distribution of all marital assets. Equitable distribution. Legal words that meant I'd finally be paid for 42 years of work. The final decree gave me the apartment, half of Tony's pension, and a portion of the savings account I'd helped build with my nursing salary before I gave up my career. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to live on with dignity. More importantly, it was acknowledgement that my life had worth, that the woman I'd been and the work I'd done mattered in the eyes of the law even if they'd never mattered to Tony. The day the divorce was finalized, I sat in my apartment now, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but the deep, quiet satisfaction of a decision made and carried through. Tony moved in with Melissa. I heard through Mrs. Chen that they were planning to get married, that they were talking about traveling and adventure and all the things Tony had claimed he couldn't afford when I'd suggested them years earlier. I felt sorry for Melissa. Not because she'd stolen my husband, but because she didn't know yet that the charming, passionate man who'd swept her off her feet would eventually take her for granted too. That the attention and affection that felt so special to her now would fade as he settled into the comfortable assumption that she would always be there, always understanding, always forgiving. Maybe she was different. Maybe she would demand better. Maybe Tony had learned something from our divorce that would make him a better husband the second time around. But that wasn't my problem anymore. For the first time in 42 years, Tony's problems weren't my problems. The freedom was intoxicating. I started small. I bought a subscription to Netflix and spent entire Saturdays watching British mysteries and romantic comedies, eating ice cream for lunch without anyone commenting on my cholesterol or asking when I was going to cook dinner. I rearranged the furniture, putting my grandmother's rocking chair by the window where it caught the afternoon light. I'd always loved that chair, but Tony said it looked old-fashioned, so it had spent decades in the bedroom where no one could see it. Now it was the first thing people noticed when they walked into my living room. I planted new flowers in the courtyard, bright yellow daffodils and purple irises that bloomed in defiant splendor each spring. The space that had once been the scene of my humiliation became a garden of my own making. Mrs. Alvarez and I started a weekly tradition of walking to Flushing Meadows Corona Park on Sunday mornings. We'd bring thermoses of coffee and bags of bread to feed the ducks, talking about everything and nothing the way real friends do. Rosa had stories about raising 5 children on a bus driver's salary, about learning English at 45 so she could help her kids with homework, about the year Eduardo got laid off and she took a job cleaning offices at night to keep their family afloat. Her stories reminded me that I wasn't the only woman who'd given everything to hold a family together. That sacrifice and strength were written into the DNA of women like us, immigrants' daughters who understood that love was spelled W-O-R-K. But Rosa also reminded me that I was more than the sum of what I'd given up. You know what I regret most, she said one Sunday, watching a mother duck guide her babies across the pond. I never learned to drive. Eduardo always said he'd teach me someday, but someday never came. After he died, I had to take 3 buses to get to his doctor appointments, to the lawyer for the will, to anywhere that mattered. She turned to look at me directly. Don't wait for someday, Sandra. You've got good years left. Make them count. Make them count. At 67, after spending most of my adult life making other people's lives count, the idea of prioritizing my own future felt both thrilling and terrifying. But Rosa was right. I did have good years left. Maybe the best years, because for the first time, they would be entirely mine. I enrolled in a computer class at the Queen's Public Library, learning to use Facebook and Instagram and email more efficiently. Technology had advanced so much while I was focused on other things, and I felt like I was catching up with a world that had left me behind. The class was full of people my age, all of us fumbling through passwords and privacy settings with the determination of students half our age. We complained about fonts being too small and wished everything wasn't so complicated, but we kept showing up because learning something new was proof that we were still alive, still capable of growth. My instructor, a patient young man named David, treated us all with genuine respect. He never made us feel stupid for asking the same question twice, never implied that we were too old to understand modern technology. "Mrs. Romano," he said one afternoon after I'd successfully attached photos to an email, "you're one of my best students. You should be proud of yourself." Proud of myself. When was the last time anyone had said that to me? Through Facebook, I reconnected with old nursing school friends I hadn't spoken to in decades. Patricia was volunteering at a free clinic in Brooklyn. Janet had started a support group for caregivers of Alzheimer's patients. Maria had traveled to Italy after her husband's death, fulfilling a dream she'd postponed for 30 years. These women, who'd given up their careers like I had, who'd raised children and supported husbands and held families together through crisis after crisis, were reclaiming pieces of themselves I'd forgotten existed. I could reclaim pieces too. The idea came to me gradually, like dawn breaking over the East River. I could go back to nursing. Not full-time, not the grueling hospital shifts I'd worked in my 20s, but part-time clinic work or private care for elderly patients. My license had expired years ago, but New York had programs for returning nurses. Refresher courses, continuing education, skills updates. It would take work, but I had time now. More importantly, I had the motivation that comes from choosing your own path instead of having it chosen for you. The State Nursing Board office was in Manhattan, a 40-minute subway ride that felt like a journey to another life. The woman behind the desk was younger than my daughter but treated me with professional courtesy as she explained the requirements for license reinstatement. "You'll need 40 hours of continuing education and a skills competency exam," she said, handing me a packet of information. "But with your experience, it should be manageable." Manageable. I'd managed a household, a marriage, and 2 children's lives for decades. I could manage this. The continuing education classes were held at a community college in Elmhurst, evenings and weekends designed for working adults. I was the oldest student by at least 15 years, but I wasn't the only one starting over. There was Carmen, a 45-year-old mother of 3 who'd gone back to school after her divorce. There was James, a former construction worker whose back injury had forced him to find a new career. There was Lisa, whose husband's death had left her financially responsible for 2 teenagers and a mortgage. We were all rebuilding something, our skills, our identity, our future. The solidarity was unexpected and comforting. I studied pharmacology and infection control, learned about new medical equipment and updated patient care protocols. My brain, which had felt sluggish and underused for years, awakened to the challenge of learning. I'd forgotten how good it felt to understand something completely, to master new information and apply it practically. The skills exam was held at a local hospital where I hadn't worked since Michael was born. Walking through those corridors, past the nurses' station where women in colorful scrubs moved with purpose and confidence, I felt like I was coming home to a part of myself I'd lost. The exam itself was nerve-wracking, drawing blood, administering medications, demonstrating proper sterile technique while an instructor watched and took notes. My hands shook at first, but muscle memory kicked in. This was something I knew how to do, something I was good at. I passed. The job I found was perfect for where I was in life, part-time work at a senior center in Bayside, providing basic health monitoring and medication management for elderly clients. 20 hours a week, flexible scheduling, and the satisfaction of using skills I'd thought were buried forever. My first day back in scrubs felt like putting on a costume for a play I'd forgotten I could perform. The badge that read, Sandra Romano, RN, seemed to belong to someone else, someone younger and more confident. But as the weeks passed, I settled back into the rhythm of healthcare, taking blood pressures, monitoring chronic conditions, listening to the fears and frustrations of people who'd lived long enough to accumulate plenty of both. My patients were mostly women, mostly alone, mostly dealing with the same issues I'd faced: adult children who were too busy to visit, husbands who'd died or left, bodies that were betraying them after decades of loyal service. I understood them in a way I couldn't have when I was younger. When Mrs. Patterson cried about her son never calling, when Mr. Fernandez worried about being a burden to his daughter, when Mrs. Kim struggled with the humiliation of needing help with tasks she'd performed independently for 80 years, I saw my own fears reflected back at me. But I also saw resilience. These people had survived wars and depression, immigration and discrimination, illness and loss. They were still here, still fighting, still finding reasons to get up each morning. If they could endure, so could I. If they could adapt, so could I. If they could find meaning in what remained of their lives instead of mourning what was lost, so could I. The paycheck wasn't much, but it was mine. Money I'd earned with my own skills, in my own name, for work that mattered. I opened a savings account and watched my balance grow slowly but steadily. More importantly, I had purpose again. Identity beyond Tony's wife or Emily and Michael's mother. I was Sandra Romano, registered nurse. Sandra Romano, who helped people manage their diabetes and remember to take their medications. Sandra Romano, who listened to their stories and treated their concerns with respect. The work gave me something I hadn't had in years: professional confidence. Colleagues who valued my opinion. Supervisors who recognized my competence. Patients who thanked me for my care and meant it. One afternoon, while I was checking vital signs for Mrs. Goldman, an elderly Holocaust survivor who came to the center 3 times a week for dialysis preparation, she grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "You saved my life today," she said, her accent still thick after 60 years in America. I'd caught a dangerous interaction between her medications that might have caused serious complications. A simple review of her pill bottles had identified a problem that could have landed her in the emergency room. "Just doing my job," I replied, but she shook her head firmly. "No, dear. You care. You pay attention. That's not just a job, that's a calling." A calling? I'd never thought of nursing that way when I was younger. It had been a practical career choice, something that would help me support a family while Tony went to school. Now I understood it differently. This was something I was meant to do, something that used not just my training but my life experience. Every loss I'd endured, every challenge I'd faced, every moment of feeling invisible or unimportant had prepared me to understand what these patients were going through. My pain had been transformed into empathy. My struggles had become strength I could share with others. The timing felt like more than coincidence when Mrs. Rodriguez, the wife of the building superintendent, approached me one evening as I was returning from work. "Sandra," she said, wringing her hands nervously, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but I heard you're a nurse now." I nodded, still adjusting to the strange pride I felt in that title. "My mother-in-law is getting out of the hospital next week after her heart surgery. She needs someone to check on her, help with her medications. The family, we don't know about these things. Would you consider private duty work? We could pay you fairly." Private duty work. The kind of personalized care that hospitals couldn't always provide, where I could really make a difference in someone's recovery. "Tell me about her situation," I said. Mrs. Rodriguez's mother-in-law, Elena, was 78 and lived alone in a basement apartment in Elmhurst. She spoke only Spanish and was terrified of hospitals, having nearly died from an infection she'd gotten after her husband's surgery 10 years earlier. She needed someone to monitor her surgical site, manage her complex medication schedule, and help her navigate the post-operative restrictions that seemed overwhelming to someone who'd been independent her entire life. She needed someone who understood what it felt like to be dismissed, ignored, treated like her concerns didn't matter. She needed someone like me. I started visiting Elena 3 times a week, checking her incision, teaching her family about her medications, helping her understand what symptoms to watch for. Her English was limited, but care transcends language barriers. A gentle touch, a patient explanation repeated as many times as necessary, the presence of someone who listens, these things are universal. Elena's recovery was textbook perfect. No infections, no complications, gradual return to independence. But more than that, she regained confidence in her ability to manage her health, to advocate for herself, to trust that her body could heal. "Usted me salvo," she told me on my last visit. "You saved me." But she'd saved me too, in ways she couldn't know. Watching her heal reminded me that recovery was possible, that starting over wasn't just survival, it was growth. Word spread in the building, then through the neighborhood. Other families needed help caring for elderly relatives. Discharge planners at local hospitals started referring patients who needed short-term care at home. I developed a small private practice, working with seniors who were transitioning from hospital to home, who needed medication management, who were dealing with chronic conditions that required monitoring but not full-time nursing care. The work was flexible, well-paid, and deeply satisfying. I was building something of my own, using skills I'd developed and experience I'd earned. But the real transformation was happening inside me. I started buying clothes that made me feel confident instead of invisible. Bright colors I'd avoided for years because Tony said they were too flashy. Scarves and jewelry that drew attention instead of deflecting it. I got my hair cut shorter and styled in a way that was both professional and flattering. The stylist, a young woman named Ashley at the salon on Roosevelt Avenue, treated me like someone whose appearance mattered. "You have beautiful bone structure," she said, shaping my gray hair into a modern bob that took years off my appearance. "You should show it off. Show it off." For decades, I'd been trying to fade into the background, to be the reliable, unnoticed support system that kept everyone else functioning. Now I was learning to take up space, to be seen, to matter in my own life. The changes were noticed. Colleagues commented on my energy. Patients remarked on my confidence. Even Rosa Alvarez, who'd known me through the worst of my marriage, watched my transformation with knowing approval. "You look like yourself again," she said one evening over our usual coffee and gossip session. "Like the woman I always knew was in there somewhere. Like myself." I was still figuring out who that was, but I was beginning to recognize her in the mirror. She was someone who woke up excited about the day ahead instead of dreading another round of unappreciated service. She was someone who made decisions about her own life instead of adapting to everyone else's needs. She was someone who had opinions and preferences and boundaries. She was someone who mattered. The legal papers finalizing my divorce arrived on a Tuesday in May, almost exactly a year after I discovered Tony's affair. I signed them in the kitchen where I'd made countless meals for a man who'd taken my devotion for granted, then walked to the mailbox myself and sent them back to the court. 43 years of legal connection dissolved into bureaucratic efficiency. I was officially single for the first time since I was 25 years old. The freedom was terrifying and exhilarating. That evening, I called Emily and Michael to let them know the divorce was final. Both conversations were stilted, my children still processing their father's betrayal and their mother's refusal to forgive it. "Are you happy now?" Emily asked, her voice tight with judgment. It was a fair question. Was I happy? Or was I just vindicated? "I'm at peace," I told her. "I'm sleeping through the night for the first time in years. I'm working at something I love. I'm making decisions about my own life. If that's what happiness is, then yes, I'm happy." "What about Dad?" "He's been calling me, crying about how much he misses you." Tony was crying. The man who'd spent the last decade of our marriage treating me like a piece of furniture was now experiencing the loss I'd been living with for years. "Your father had 42 years to show me how much I meant to him," I said. "He chose to show someone else instead. I'm sorry he's hurting, but his pain doesn't cancel out mine. Can't you forgive him? For the family? For the family." How many times had I heard those words? How many compromises had I made? How many hurts had I swallowed? How much of myself had I sacrificed for the family? Emily, for 42 years, I was the family. I held everyone together, smoothed over every crisis, put everyone else's needs before my own. I was the family when your father was too drunk to come home. I was the family when he forgot anniversaries and birthdays. I was the family when you were in rehab and Michael was struggling in school. I was always the family. My voice was getting stronger, years of suppressed frustration finally finding expression. But when your father decided he needed someone who made him feel alive, I wasn't family anymore. I was just the familiar option he could take for granted while he found excitement elsewhere. "You can't ask me to save a family that doesn't include me." Emily was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said finally. "I didn't realize. I never thought about it that way." Michael's reaction was similar but more analytical, as was his nature. He wanted to understand the financial implications, the practical considerations, the logistics of our new reality. "Are you going to be okay financially?" he asked. "Do you need help with anything?" The question touched me more than he probably realized. When had anyone in my family last asked what I needed? "I'm going to be fine," I told him. "Better than fine, actually. I'm working again, doing something I love. I have my own income, my own savings account, my own life." "You sound different," he said. "I feel different. I feel like myself." It took both my children time to adjust to the idea of their mother as someone other than Tony's wife. They'd grown up seeing me as half of a unit, never as a complete person in my own right. But gradually, as months passed and they saw me thriving instead of just surviving, their resistance faded into acceptance. Emily started calling more often, wanting to hear about my work and my patients. Michael began including me in conversations about his own life instead of just updating me about his father's situation. They were learning to see me as Sandra instead of just as Mom. It was an adjustment for all of us. The biggest test came that Christmas, our first major holiday since the divorce. In previous years, I'd spent weeks planning elaborate celebrations, cooking, decorating, shopping for gifts everyone would forget by January. The apartment would be filled with relatives and noise and the careful orchestration required to keep everyone happy and fed. This year, I made different choices. I invited Rosa Alvarez to share Christmas dinner with me. Just the two of us, in my quiet apartment, with a simple meal and meaningful conversation. Instead of stress and exhaustion, I felt gratitude. Instead of performing happiness for everyone else's benefit, I experienced genuine contentment. Emily and Michael were spending the holiday with Tony and Melissa, a development that might have devastated me a year earlier. Instead, I felt relief. No forced cheerfulness, no pretending everything was fine, no managing everyone else's emotions while suppressing my own. Rosa brought homemade flan and stories about Christmas traditions in Puerto Rico. We ate slowly, talked freely, laughed genuinely. It was the most peaceful Christmas I'd had in decades. "You know what I love about this?" Rosa said, raising her glass of wine in a toast. "We're two women who survived everything life threw at us, and we're still here. Still able to find joy. Still able to make new traditions. New traditions. For 70 years, I'd followed other people's traditions, fit myself into other people's expectations, lived other people's version of what my life should be. Now I was free to create traditions that reflected who I actually was instead of who everyone needed me to be. Spring brought unexpected opportunities. The senior center where I worked was expanding their home health program, and they offered me a position as a supervisor. More responsibility, better pay, and the chance to train other nurses in the kind of personalized care I'd been providing. The interview process was rigorous but fair. I presented case studies from my private practice, demonstrated my clinical skills, articulated my philosophy of patient-centered care. It was the first professional evaluation I'd undergone based purely on my own merit, without reference to anyone else's needs or expectations. I got the job. The promotion came with a raise that lifted me solidly into middle-class independence. For the first time since giving up my career to support Tony's education, I had genuine financial security based on my own work. The celebration dinner was at a restaurant Rosa and I had been wanting to try, an upscale place in Manhattan that I would never have considered when every dollar had to be justified in terms of family priorities. To new beginnings, Rosa toasted, raising her glass of sangria. To old strengths, I replied, touching my glass to hers. Because that's what this was, not a completely new life, but the resurrection of parts of myself that had been buried under decades of service to other people's dreams. The work I was doing now, the confidence I was developing, the independence I was claiming, all of it had been there before, waiting to be rediscovered. I'd been a competent nurse at 25. I was a better nurse at 68, seasoned by life experience and freed from the distractions that had pulled me away from my calling. I'd been capable of making good decisions for other people my entire adult life. Now I was learning to make good decisions for myself. The apartment that had once felt like a prison now felt like sanctuary. I'd redecorated gradually, replacing furniture that held painful memories with pieces that reflected my current tastes instead of married compromises. The bedroom now had a reading chair by the window where I spent Sunday mornings with coffee and the Times, no longer hurrying to prepare breakfast for someone who rarely thanked me for it. The kitchen counters held plants instead of prescription bottles and to-do lists for other people's lives. The living room showcased photos from my nursing school graduation, awards from my volunteer work, pictures of me with Rosa and my colleagues, images of a woman with her own accomplishments and relationships. Tony's presence had been erased not through anger but through indifference. After mourning the loss of what I'd thought we had, I'd moved on to building what I actually wanted. He'd become irrelevant to my daily happiness, which was perhaps the most complete victory possible. The anniversary of our divorce passed without ceremony or reflection. I was too busy living my new life to spend much time analyzing my old one. But sometimes, usually late at night when the city was quiet and I had space to think, I'd consider the strange trajectory that had brought me to this point. How betrayal had become liberation. How loss had become opportunity. How the worst thing that had ever happened to me had led to some of the best. I didn't forgive Tony. Forgiveness implies a debt that's been cancelled, a wrong that's been made right. What he did wasn't forgivable, it was a fundamental violation of trust that had dissolved our marriage as surely as acid dissolves metal. But I didn't hate him either. Hate requires too much energy, too much emotional investment in someone who no longer deserved space in my thoughts. I felt nothing for him, which was exactly what he'd earned through 42 years of taking my love for granted. The indifference was liberating. For decades, my emotional life had been tied to his moods, his needs, his approval or disappointment. Now my feelings belonged to me, available for investments that would actually provide returns. My patients loved me because I cared about their recovery. My colleagues respected me because I was competent and reliable. Rosa valued my friendship because I brought genuine attention and affection to our relationship. These were people who appreciated what I offered, who recognized my worth, who treated me like someone who mattered. This was what reciprocal relationship felt like. This was what I'd been missing in my marriage without even realizing I was missing it. The second year of my new life brought challenges I hadn't anticipated. Tony made several attempts to reconcile, each more desperate than the last. Phone calls where he cried about his mistakes. Letters promising changes he should have made decades earlier. Gifts that showed up at my apartment, flowers, jewelry, even a new coffee maker to replace the one that had broken. I returned everything unopened. Emily and Michael pressured me to, at least listen to him, as if my problem had been poor communication rather than 42 years of being treated like a convenience rather than a partner. He's learned his lesson, Michael insisted during one particularly frustrating phone call. He knows he messed up. He had 42 years to learn that lesson, I replied. I'm not interested in teaching it to him again. But Mom, he's miserable. I was miserable for the last decade of our marriage. Did anyone care about that? Did anyone suggest Dad should change his behavior to make me happier? The silence told me everything I needed to know. Even Melissa, Tony's new wife, attempted to make contact. She called the senior center where I worked, claiming she wanted to make things right between us. I listened politely as she explained that she'd never meant to hurt me, that she'd fallen in love despite herself, that she hoped we could find a way to be civilized for the sake of the family. "Mrs. Rodriguez," I said when she finished her rehearsed speech, "you didn't steal my husband. He chose to give you what belonged to me. That was his decision, not yours. But now you have to live with what you've chosen." "What do you mean?" "I mean that a man who cheated on his wife of 42 years is capable of cheating on his wife of 2 years. You got him by being exciting and different. What happens when you're no longer exciting? When you become familiar? When you start making demands or having needs that conflict with his comfort?" I wasn't being cruel. I was being factual. "The Tony you fell in love with was the version of himself he presents to women who don't know him well enough to expect better. I got the version he saves for women who've already committed to staying." I wished her luck and hung up. Whatever happened in their marriage was no longer my problem to solve or my pain to carry. The third year brought the sweetest kind of validation. I was promoted again, this time to Director of Community Health Services for the entire Queens region. The position came with a salary that exceeded what I'd been earning as a young nurse, benefits that provided better security than my marriage ever had, and respect that I'd earned through my own efforts. The interview panel included doctors, administrators, and community leaders who evaluated me based on my experience, my vision, and my track record of results. No one asked about my personal life or made allowances for family obligations. They saw me as a professional, pure and simple. The job meant supervising 15 nurses, developing programs for underserved populations, and representing our organization at city health department meetings. It meant having opinions that mattered, making decisions that affected thousands of people, being recognized as an expert in my field. It meant being someone instead of being someone's something. My first staff meeting was both terrifying and exhilarating. 15 competent professionals looking to me for leadership, guidance, and vision. These weren't family members who took my contributions for granted. These were colleagues who needed me to be good at my job so they could be good at theirs. The responsibility was energizing rather than draining because it came with authority instead of just obligation. I implemented new training programs, improved patient outcomes, streamlined administrative processes. The changes I made mattered to real people living real lives, and the success was measurable in ways that cooking dinner and managing household crises had never been. 6 months into the position, I received a public recognition award from the Queens Borough President for outstanding service to senior citizens. The ceremony was held at Borough Hall, with local politicians and community leaders in attendance. I stood at the podium in a navy blue dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, looking out at an audience of people who saw me as Sandra Romano, healthcare leader, rather than Sandra Romano, abandoned wife. "This work matters," I said in my acceptance speech, "because every senior citizen in our community deserves dignity, respect, and access to quality healthcare. They've earned it through lifetimes of contribution, and they deserve our very best efforts." The applause was genuine, sustained, appreciative. These people were clapping for my work, my ideas, my leadership. I'd never experienced professional recognition before. During my first nursing career, I'd been too young and inexperienced to be considered for awards or leadership positions. During my marriage, I'd been too busy managing Tony's needs and the children's crises to develop the expertise that leads to recognition. Now, at 70, I was finally being seen for who I actually was instead of what role I played in other people's lives. The award ceremony was covered in the local paper, a small article with my photo and a quote about the importance of community-based healthcare for seniors. It was the first time my name had appeared in print for something I'd achieved rather than something that had happened to me. I framed the article and hung it in my office, next to my nursing degree and professional certificates. Evidence of a life I'd built myself. Rosa threw a celebration party in the community room of our building, inviting neighbors and friends I'd made through work. 30 people showed up to congratulate me, to tell stories about how my work had helped them or their families, to treat me like someone whose success mattered to them. I looked around the room at faces that reflected genuine affection and respect, and realized this was what community felt like. Not the obligatory family gatherings where I'd always been the one ensuring everyone else's comfort, but voluntary relationships based on mutual appreciation and shared values. These people chose to celebrate with me. They weren't there out of duty or blood relation but because they valued what I brought to their lives. It was intoxicating. The 4th year of my new life brought an opportunity I'd never expected. The mayor's office was creating a task force on aging in place, bringing together experts from across the city to develop policies that would help seniors remain in their homes and communities as they aged. They wanted someone with both clinical expertise and community experience. Someone who understood healthcare from the ground up, who had worked directly with the populations most affected by these policies. They wanted me. The appointment was announced in a press release that described me as a respected healthcare leader with 4 decades of nursing experience and a proven track record of improving outcomes for underserved seniors. 4 decades of nursing experience. The years I'd taken off to raise children and support Tony's career were being counted as part of my professional journey rather than seen as a gap in my resume. The work I'd done as a wife and mother, managing healthcare decisions for my family, advocating for Michael's educational needs, navigating Emily's addiction treatment, all of it was being recognized as relevant experience that had prepared me for this role. My life was being seen as coherent rather than fragmented, purposeful rather than merely reactive. The task force met monthly at City Hall, bringing together social workers, doctors, urban planners, economists, and community activists. I was the only former homemaker in the group, the only one whose expertise had been developed partly through personal experience rather than purely through formal education. But my voice carried equal weight. When I spoke about the challenges facing elderly women living alone, people listened. When I proposed solutions based on what I'd learned in my community work, they were taken seriously. I was contributing to policy decisions that would affect hundreds of thousands of people. My opinions about healthcare, housing, and social services were being incorporated into official recommendations that would be implemented across all 5 boroughs. At 71, I was having more impact on the world around me than I'd ever had during my decades of marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman Tony had found boring and predictable was now being consulted by city officials about complex policy issues. The wife he'd taken for granted was being quoted in newspaper articles and interviewed on local radio shows. The life he'd found insufficiently exciting was now filled with purpose, recognition, and genuine accomplishment. I didn't gloat about this strange reversal. I rarely thought about Tony at all anymore. But when I did, it was with mild puzzlement about how someone could have lived with me for 42 years and never noticed that I was intelligent, capable, and worthy of respect. His loss, as they say. Literally. The 5th year brought the deepest kind of satisfaction, mentorship opportunities that allowed me to help other women navigate similar transitions. The Senior Center started a support group for women over 60 who were dealing with divorce, widowhood, or other major life changes. They asked me to facilitate it, drawing on both my professional training and my personal experience. The first meeting drew 8 women, ages 62 to 78. Each had a story of loss, betrayal, or abandonment. Each was struggling with the practical and emotional challenges of rebuilding a life that had been defined by relationships with other people. Maria, 64, was recently widowed after 40 years of marriage to a man who'd handled their finances entirely. She didn't know how to pay bills online or understand their investment accounts. Janet, 72, had been divorced for 3 years but still felt guilty about breaking up the family, despite her ex-husband's gambling addiction that had cost them their house. Carmen, 66, had spent 30 years caring for her disabled husband, who'd recently moved into a nursing home. She felt simultaneously relieved and guilty, liberated and lost. Each woman's story was different, but the underlying themes were universal. How do you rebuild an identity when it's been subsumed into someone else's needs for decades? How do you make decisions for yourself when you've always been making them for other people? How do you trust your own judgment when everyone around you has told you it doesn't matter? How do you learn to matter to yourself? I shared my own story, not as a model to be copied but as evidence that transformation was possible. That women our age could learn new skills, develop new relationships, create new purposes. That it was never too late to choose yourself. The group grew quickly, word spreading through informal networks of women who were hungry for support and understanding. Within 6 months, we had 20 regular participants and a waiting list. The stories were heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. Women who'd discovered they were stronger than they'd ever imagined. Women who'd found careers in their 70s, started businesses in their 60s, gone back to school in their 80s. Women who'd learned that their worth wasn't determined by their usefulness to other people. The group became a laboratory for exploring what life looked like when you put yourself first. Not selfishly, but sensibly. Not in opposition to family and community, but in service to the fullest expression of who you actually were. We celebrated small victories, Rosa finally getting her driver's license at 75, Janet starting an online jewelry business using skills she'd never monetized, Carmen traveling to Italy alone and loving every minute of it. We supported each other through setbacks, family members who resented our newfound independence, financial challenges that threatened our security, health issues that reminded us of our mortality. We learned to ask for what we needed instead of waiting for someone to notice we needed it. We learned to say no without elaborate justifications. We learned to invest our emotional energy in relationships that provided returns rather than just demands. We learned to matter to ourselves, which turned out to be the prerequisite for mattering to anyone else in a healthy way. The media attention was unexpected but welcome. A reporter from The Times wrote a feature article about our group, exploring the phenomenon of late-life reinvention among women who'd spent decades in traditional caregiving roles. The article was titled Second Acts: Women Over 60 Reclaim Their Lives After Loss, and it included my photo and several quotes about the potential for growth and change at any age. The response was overwhelming. Letters from women across the country who'd found hope in our story. Requests for information about starting similar groups in other communities. Invitations to speak at conferences about aging, women's issues, and community health. I'd become an expert in something I'd never intended to study: the resilience of women whose circumstances had forced them to rediscover their own strength. The speaking engagements were both thrilling and terrifying. Standing in front of audiences of social workers, healthcare professionals, and community organizers, sharing insights I'd gained through my own painful journey. The women in our group aren't victims, I would tell these audiences. They're survivors who've learned to thrive. The skills they developed managing families and households for decades are exactly the skills they need to rebuild their lives. They just need permission to use those skills for themselves instead of always for other people. The message resonated because it was true. The organizational abilities, emotional intelligence, and problem-solving skills that women develop through caregiving are incredibly valuable. We'd just never been encouraged to see them as valuable or to apply them to our own needs. The 6th year brought a transformation I hadn't expected, a romantic relationship that developed slowly and naturally out of mutual respect and genuine compatibility. David Hernandez was a retired high school principal who'd started volunteering at the senior center where I worked. He was 73, recently widowed after a loving 50-year marriage to his high school sweetheart, and still adjusting to life without the partner who'd been his closest friend and collaborator. We met during a staff meeting about expanding our educational programming for seniors. David had experience developing curricula and managing teachers, skills our center needed as we planned computer classes, health workshops, and continuing education programs. Our relationship began as a professional collaboration. David would propose educational initiatives, and I would evaluate them from a healthcare and community service perspective. We worked well together, our different backgrounds providing complementary insights. The partnership was respectful from the beginning. David asked for my opinions and listened to my answers. He valued my expertise and deferred to my knowledge about our client population. When we disagreed, he engaged with my arguments rather than dismissing them. It was the first time I'd worked closely with a man who treated me like an equal colleague rather than someone whose contributions were automatically less important than his own. The friendship developed gradually. Coffee meetings to discuss programming turned into longer conversations about our experiences in education and healthcare. Professional respect deepened into personal appreciation as we discovered shared values and compatible personalities. David had been a good husband, I learned. He'd supported his wife Rosa through breast cancer, raised 3 children who still called regularly, maintained friendships spanning decades. He understood what partnership actually meant because he'd lived it successfully. When Rosa died after a brief illness, David had grieved honestly and thoroughly. He wasn't looking to replace her or trying to escape loneliness through distraction. He was slowly building a new life that honored his past while leaving room for different kinds of happiness. It was the healthiest approach to loss I'd ever witnessed. Our first official date was dinner at a quiet restaurant in Astoria, chosen specifically because it wasn't anywhere I'd gone with Tony. I wanted the evening to belong entirely to this new possibility rather than being contaminated by old memories. David was nervous, which I found endearing. At 73, he was as uncertain about dating protocols as a teenager. But his nervousness came from wanting to treat me well, to show appropriate respect for what we might be building together. I haven't done this in 54 years, he confessed over appetizers. I'm not sure I remember how. I haven't done it well in 42 years, I replied. We can figure it out together. The conversation flowed easily. David was genuinely curious about my work, my thoughts, my experiences. He asked follow-up questions that showed he was actually listening to my answers rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. He told me about his marriage with obvious love but without the desperate clinging to the past that would have prevented him from being fully present with me. Rosa had been the center of his life, but her death didn't mean the end of his capacity for connection. It meant he knew how to value what he had while he had it. The physical attraction was surprising to me. I'd assumed that part of my life was over, that my 71-year-old body was beyond romance. But David looked at me like I was beautiful, touched my hand like I was precious, kissed me goodnight like I was worth pursuing. It had been so long since anyone had touched me with genuine affection that I'd forgotten how good it felt to be desired rather than merely tolerated. The relationship progressed slowly by choice rather than by circumstance. We both understood that we weren't filling empty spaces in each other's lives but adding richness to lives that were already full. David had his own apartment, his own routine, his own friendships and interests. I had mine. We came together because we enhanced each other's happiness, not because we needed each other to function. It was the opposite of the codependent relationship I'd had with Tony, where my identity had been subsumed into his needs and his identity had been built on my constant availability. David and I were two complete people choosing to share parts of our lives rather than two incomplete people trying to merge into one functional unit. The difference was revolutionary. 6 months into our relationship, David asked if I'd like to take a trip with him to visit his daughter in Oregon. It would mean meeting his family, being introduced as someone significant in his life. I said yes, and realized it was the first time in decades that I'd made a major decision based purely on what I wanted to do rather than what was expected of me or what would serve someone else's needs. The trip was wonderful. David's daughter and son-in-law treated me with warm hospitality, clearly happy to see their father with someone who brought out his best qualities. Their children, David's grandchildren, were curious and accepting in the way kids are when adults don't make a big deal about new relationships. I wasn't trying to replace their grandmother. I wasn't competing with a ghost or attempting to fill a specific role in their family structure. I was just Sandra, someone their grandfather cared about, someone who made him smile more often. The simplicity was refreshing. On our last evening in Portland, David and I walked along the Columbia River as the sun set over the Cascade Mountains. The beauty was overwhelming, purple sky reflected in dark water, snow-capped peaks glowing pink in the distance, the kind of scenery that makes you grateful to be alive to witness it. I never thought I'd feel this way again, David said, taking my hand as we walked. What way? Excited about the future. Rosa and I had 50 wonderful years together, but they were years we built when we were young. I thought that part of life was over, the part where you make plans with someone else, where you have shared dreams. I understood exactly what he meant. After my divorce, I'd assumed romance was finished for me. That whatever relationships I developed would be practical or social but not passionate, not meaningful in the way that changes how you see your own life. I'm excited too, I admitted. About us, but also about everything. About tomorrow and next month and next year. I haven't felt that way in so long I'd forgotten it was possible. We're not too old for this, are we? David asked, half joking but half serious. We're exactly the right age for this, I replied. We know who we are. We know what matters. We know how rare it is to find someone who sees you clearly and likes what they see. We know how to appreciate what we have instead of taking it for granted. Exactly. The 7th year of my new life brought the kind of professional recognition I'd never imagined possible. The work I'd been doing with the Aging in Place Task Force had resulted in policy changes that were being implemented across New York City. Our recommendations for community health programs had been adopted by the Department for the Aging. Our proposals for improving healthcare access for homebound seniors had been incorporated into the city budget. Our research on successful aging models had been published in academic journals. I was invited to speak at the National Conference on Aging in Washington, D.C., presenting our findings to healthcare professionals, policymakers, and researchers from across the country. The presentation was scheduled for 45 minutes in a ballroom filled with 800 people. I'd spoken to smaller groups many times by then, but this was different. This was the national stage, recognition as an expert whose work had implications beyond New York City. I wore a red dress for the presentation, red because it was powerful, because it commanded attention, because the woman who'd spent decades trying to be invisible was now claiming her right to be seen. The speech went well. The research was solid, the recommendations were practical, the implications were significant for communities dealing with rapidly aging populations. But the part that got the most response was personal. I talked about my own journey from abandoned wife to community leader, from someone whose value was determined by her usefulness to others to someone whose worth was inherent in her own capabilities. The women I work with every day aren't just survivors, I told that audience. They're proof that transformation is possible at any age, that resilience can be developed through adversity, that the strongest trees are often those that have weathered the worst storms. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Afterward, dozens of people approached me with their own stories, their own struggles, their own examples of late-life reinvention. A 74-year-old doctor who'd started a free clinic after her husband's death. A 68-year-old teacher who'd become a community organizer after her divorce. A 79-year-old engineer who'd launched a nonprofit focused on technology training for seniors. Women who discovered that the ends of their old lives had become the beginnings of their best lives. The conference led to consulting opportunities, invitations to join national policy committees, requests to write articles and book chapters about successful aging and late-life transitions. I was becoming known in professional circles, my opinions sought and my experience valued. At 72, I had more career momentum than I'd ever had in my life. The success hadn't come despite my age, it had come because of it. The decades of experience I'd accumulated, the wisdom I'd gained through struggle, the perspective that comes only from surviving and thriving through multiple life transitions. All of it was valuable. All of it was being recognized and utilized and appreciated. The 8th year brought a decision I'd been contemplating for months. David and I had been together for 2 years, our relationship deepening into the kind of partnership I'd never experienced before. We spent most evenings together, traveled frequently, made decisions collaboratively. We'd introduced each other to our families and friends. We'd supported each other through health scares and celebrated each other's professional achievements. We were building a life together, but we'd been doing it across 2 separate apartments, maintaining the independence that had become precious to both of us after decades of marriages where our individual needs had been subsumed into family obligations. David suggested we might want to consider living together, not because it was expected or convenient, but because we'd reached the point where being apart felt artificial. "I love having my own space," he said over dinner one evening. "But I love sharing space with you more." I felt the same way. The nights when David wasn't staying over felt lonely in a way that being alone hadn't felt for years. The mornings when we weren't having coffee together felt incomplete. We weren't moving in together because we couldn't afford separate apartments or because society expected it of us. We were choosing to share our daily lives because that choice enhanced our happiness rather than diminishing our independence. The difference mattered. We chose my apartment because it was larger and had the courtyard where I still grew vegetables and flowers. David moved most of his furniture into storage, keeping only the pieces that held special meaning or fit well with my existing arrangements. The integration was surprisingly smooth. We'd both been single long enough to develop strong preferences and established routines, but we'd also learned the art of compromise in ways we hadn't understood when we were younger. When you know who you are, accommodation doesn't feel like loss of identity. When you choose your partner from a position of strength rather than need, sharing doesn't feel like sacrifice. I kept my own checking account, my own credit cards, my own professional obligations. David maintained his own friendships, his own hobbies, his own relationship with his children. But we also created joint routines: morning coffee together before work, evening walks through the neighborhood, weekend trips to museums and concerts and places we'd never explored. We were modeling something I'd never seen in my parents' generation: relationships between equals who enhanced each other's lives without losing themselves in the process. My children's reaction to David was complicated but ultimately positive. They'd grown accustomed to seeing me as an independent woman with my own life and priorities. David wasn't a threat to their inheritance or a replacement for their father, he was simply someone who made their mother happy. Emily, now in her mid-40s and finally stable in her recovery, actually seemed relieved that I had a partner. "I worried about you being lonely," she admitted during one of our regular phone calls. "David seems really good for you." Michael was more analytical, evaluating David's financial stability and long-term health prospects with the practical concern of an accountant who wanted to ensure I wasn't making an imprudent decision. But both children could see that I was thriving in ways I never had during my marriage to their father. I was more confident, more engaged, more genuinely happy than they'd ever seen me. The relationship was clearly adding to my life rather than constraining it. The 9th year brought news that tested our new partnership in ways I hadn't expected. David was diagnosed with prostate cancer, caught early during a routine screening but requiring surgery and several months of recovery. My first instinct was to put everything else on hold: my work, my commitments, my own needs, to focus entirely on his care. It was the pattern I'd learned over decades of marriage, the assumption that my role was to subordinate my life to someone else's crisis. But David wouldn't let me do it. "Sandra," he said after his diagnosis was confirmed, "I need you to promise me something. I need you to promise you won't stop being yourself because I'm sick." "What do you mean?" "I mean, don't give up your work, don't cancel your speaking engagements, don't make my illness the center of your life." I fell in love with a woman who had her own purpose and priorities. I don't want this to change that. It was the first time anyone had ever asked me not to sacrifice myself for their needs. The request was both liberating and frightening. How do you care for someone you love without losing yourself in their illness? How do you provide support without becoming defined by your caregiving role? I had to learn a new kind of love, one that included boundaries, one that maintained my own integrity while offering genuine assistance. I took time off during David's surgery and immediate recovery, but I didn't abandon my other responsibilities. I rescheduled rather than canceled my commitments. I found ways to provide care that utilized my professional skills without consuming my entire identity. David's prognosis was excellent: the cancer had been caught early, the surgery was successful, the recovery was proceeding normally. But the experience taught us both something important about the relationship we'd built. We could weather crises without losing ourselves. We could provide support without becoming codependent. We could face uncertainty together while maintaining our individual strength. It was what partnership was supposed to look like. The 10th year of my new life brought an honor I'd never anticipated. The mayor's office nominated me for the city's Outstanding Senior Achievement Award, recognizing my contributions to healthcare, community service, and advocacy for older adults. The ceremony was held at Gracie Mansion, with city officials, community leaders, and family members in attendance. Emily flew in from Phoenix and Michael drove down from Boston, both of them beaming with pride as they watched their mother receive recognition for achievements that were entirely her own. David was there too, recovered from his surgery and as proud as if the award had been his own. Rosa Alvarez, now 81 and still my closest friend, sat in the front row wearing her best dress and an enormous smile. The citation read, "For 4 decades of distinguished service to the residents of Queens, demonstrating that age is not a barrier to innovation, leadership, and community impact." 4 decades. They were counting my entire adult life, the years as a young nurse, the years as a mother and wife, the years as a community volunteer, the years as a healthcare administrator. All of it was being recognized as part of a continuous contribution to my community. My life was being seen as coherent rather than fragmented, meaningful rather than merely dutiful. Standing at the podium in the mansion's elegant reception room, looking out at faces that reflected genuine appreciation and respect, I thought about the woman I'd been 10 years earlier. Broken, betrayed, convinced that her life was essentially over at 67. If I could go back and tell her what was waiting, the career success, the meaningful work, the loving relationship, the recognition, the absolute certainty that she mattered, she would never have believed it. But it was all true. Every day of struggle had led to this moment of triumph. Every loss had created space for something better. Every ending had become a beginning. The acceptance speech was brief but heartfelt. I talked about the importance of community, the resilience of older adults, the potential for growth and contribution at any age. But mostly, I talked about second chances. About the women in our support group who discovered they were stronger than they'd ever imagined. About the patients who'd taught me that healing is always possible. About the colleagues who'd shown me what collaboration really means. About the husband who'd betrayed me and, in doing so, had freed me to discover who I actually was instead of who everyone expected me to be. I didn't mention Tony by name. He'd become irrelevant to the story of my success, a minor character in the early chapters of a book that had taken an entirely different and better direction. The applause was sustained and genuinely appreciative. Afterward, dozens of people approached with congratulations, stories about how my work had affected their families, invitations to new opportunities and collaborations. I was surrounded by people who saw me clearly and celebrated what they saw. People who valued my opinions, respected my expertise, appreciated my contributions. People who understood that I mattered. The celebration continued at home, where David had organized a small dinner party with our closest friends. The apartment was filled with flowers, laughter, and the kind of warmth that comes from genuine affection rather than dutiful obligation. Looking around the table at these faces, David's loving pride, Rosa's maternal joy, Emily's surprised admiration, Michael's analytical approval, I realized this was what family actually meant. Not shared DNA or legal obligations, but chosen connection between people who enhanced each other's lives through mutual respect and genuine care. This was the family I'd built for myself after the family I'd inherited had proven inadequate to my needs. This was what love looked like when it wasn't taken for granted. Now, as I sit here at 77, reflecting on the decade that transformed my life from tragedy to triumph, I want you to understand something important. I didn't take everything from Tony in our divorce because I was vindictive or greedy. I took what belonged to me, half of what we'd built together, compensation for 42 years of unpaid labor, recognition of my contributions to our shared life. What I actually took from him was much more valuable than money or property. I took the power he'd held over my sense of self-worth. I reclaimed the authority to define my own value. I retrieved the right to prioritize my own needs and dreams. I took back my life. The camera that revealed his betrayal became the tool of my liberation. The evidence that destroyed my marriage became the foundation of my independence. The worst day of my old life became the first day of my new one. I didn't win because I punished him. I won because I finally chose myself. The money from the divorce settlement is still sitting in my investment account, growing steadily through conservative stock market investments and some cryptocurrency purchases David helped me understand. My salary and consulting fees have eliminated any financial worries I might have had about retirement. But the real fortune I gained wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in dignity, in purpose, in the absolute certainty that my life has meaning beyond my usefulness to other people. If you're listening to this story and recognizing yourself in my struggles, I want you to know something. It's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to demand respect. It's never too late to build a life that reflects your worth instead of other people's expectations. You don't have to accept being taken for granted. You don't have to settle for relationships that diminish you. You don't have to spend your remaining years grateful for scraps of attention from people who should be grateful for your presence in their lives. You deserve better. You've always deserved better. And better is still possible, no matter how old you are or how long you've been settling for less. The women in our support group range in age from 62 to 84. Every one of them discovered strengths they didn't know they had. Every one of them built new lives that honored their worth. Every one of them learned to matter to themselves. If we can do it, so can you. The betrayal that broke my heart also broke the chains that had kept me small and grateful and invisible. The husband who found me boring discovered too late that he'd lost someone irreplaceable. The family that took my sacrifices for granted learned that my contributions had actual value. The divorce papers that ended my marriage became the birth certificate for my real life. Have you ever lived through something like this? Have you ever felt invisible in your own life, taken for granted by the people you loved most? Have you ever wondered what might be possible if you finally chose yourself? Tell me about it in the comments. Your story matters. Your pain is real. Your potential is unlimited. And if this story has touched your heart or given you hope, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your engagement helps ensure that messages like this reach other people who need to hear them. Together, we can remind each other that it's never too late to matter. It's never too late to choose ourselves. It's never too late to discover that our best years might still be ahead of us. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for believing that transformation is possible. Thank you for understanding that sometimes the end of one life is just the beginning of another. Remember, you are worth fighting for. You always have been.